So to update our service to now run as a foreground service, as we mentioned, all we need to do is call start foreground. And we see the documentation for it here. Start foreground is very simple. Right? It takes in basically an integer ID and a notification. And it really is that simple. But there are some details to it. One thing that's not very clearly documented is kind of what's this ID for? Basically, the information you're passing in here has mostly to do with the notifications that you want to use for the user. So when you call start foreground, the two parameters you're passing in are very much like what's available from the notification manager when you call the notify function. So basically the ID is just some unique identifier in your application. The only requirement is that it be an integer and that you only use it uniquely for each notification that you're tracking. Because any interactions you want to have with that notification, you're going to use that ID for. Now, when it comes to creating a notification, it sounds simple enough, right? So it says, well, to create a notification, we just need the icon we're going to use, the text, and then a timestamp, right? So it seems like it should be pretty straightforward, right? So let's take a look at our code here, and let's take our service, and let's go ahead and make it a foreground service. All right, so now go ahead and take our service and make it a foreground service. And we know we'll need a notification. Let's just go ahead and create a class member variable for that. So we've got that there. Now, in order to start ourselves in the foreground, we're going to have to go ahead and construct an instance of this notification. Right, so let's just go ahead and add a method to our service that just says start in foreground. And so what we want to do in here, of course, is first construct that notification and then go ahead and call our start foreground. There are three things we need for a notification. Where we need to have an icon for it. You notice here I've got an icon here, Pluralsight 24 by 24. If I double click on that, right, that is the proper size icon for a high resolution device. The docs say that high res devices use 24 by 24 icons. Medium res should use 16 by 16, right? So we're targeting our high res primarily for these demos, so we'll just use a 24 by 24. So back here in my service. So first thing I need to do is just have my notification icon. I'll use my r.drawable, and of course that icon. Right. Next thing I need is the text I want to display. So I'm going to call this my notification, and we'll have first our ticker text. Right. That's the text that's displayed when the message first shows in the status bar. Right. Then we need a timestamp that's going to actually be used in the status bar. So with that, we've got everything we need to create the initial notification. Right, so I'll just go here and I'll just say foreground notification equals new our notification, and we pass in our three parameters. Right, we pass in our notification icon, our text, and then finally our timestamp. So that's what we need to have our notification. Remember, the next thing we want to do is call this in foreground, and we have to give it some kind of ID. Right, again, it can be any number we want. It's just what we're going to use to refer to this. So now to set up that ID, the easiest thing to do, I find, at least, is just set up a constant for it. Remember, it can be any integer value as long as you use it uniquely. In other words, every notification has its own unique value. So we'll just use that value of 1. And so now with that in place, I can go back down to my function here. And it would seem that all I should have to do now is, remember, I want to just say that start foreground, right? So I'll say start foreground, and I've got my notification ID, and I've got my foreground notification. All right, so now the only thing left to do is call our start in foreground. Now, since we want our service to go ahead and just be always a foreground service now, we'll just go ahead and put up here in our onCreate and make that call. So it seems like we should have done everything we need to do. We've created the notification. We've called start in foreground. But let's see what happens now when we try to run this. So we've got our service here, right? So we go ahead and say menu, do work. You notice we get, basically, hey, sorry, your program crashed. Right, so let's take a look at what happened here. We go out here into our logcat. And you see here we've got a fatal exception, right? Illegal argument, that's all it tells us. And it turns out that creating the notification wasn't quite enough. We need to do a little bit more with it. Although we've created what appears to be a valid notification, we actually haven't provided all the information. If you look at what we provided here, we provided the icon, and we talked about the ticker text, right? The text to show when things first show up, and the timestamp. But remember we said that as part of the status information, we have to provide some title text to show when the user looks at the status bar, right? Some additional body text, and also what to do if the user actually selects our entry, right? So we have to attach that additional information to the notification, right? So what we'll do here, let's declare a couple more fields. We'll go from there. So first thing we said is that we want to have the title text, right? So this will be the text that actually shows up when someone looks at our notification in the status bar. And we'll just set that to say something like plural site service. Again, we're going to have the body text that shows up there too. And we'll just say something like, does non-UI processing. Now, obviously, in your service, it would be something more meaningful. Right? Now, we want to go ahead and we want to go ahead and trigger an event when the user actually selects our status. And what we want to do is, why don't we just go ahead and show our actual activity. In other words, we'll just bring up our regular application screen if the user selects us from the status screen. Right, so the way we do that in .NET, the way we do that in Android is where we create an intent. Right, and just like we create an intent for services, right, I can create an intent that's actually tied to an activity. Right, so basically, this is an intent that says that I want to create an instance of my activity class. And whenever we deal with triggering any kind of event that's based on an intent in Android, we have to use a pending intent to wrap it with. Right, all we have to do there is just say, well, it's a pending intent. You have to say what it's for, which means it's going to be to get an activity. Then we pass in our context. We pass in 0 for the values, the intent that we created. Right, so basically this is the standard mechanism we use in Android whenever we want to tie launching some kind of activity to some external event. Right, so now we've got all that defined, what we have to do now is go to our notification. And what we do is we say set last event info. This identifies the information we want to display and what to do if the user selects us in the status bar. So now we've not only described the notifications we did here, but we actually provided all the information necessary so we can display the information in the status bar. And if the user actually taps on it, go ahead and trigger displaying of our activity. Okay, we'll go ahead and run this in our emulator. Okay, our application is now running. So I'm going to say menu, do work. If you go up top, you can see plural site service starting. Shows up top there. That goes away. You see that actually our icon shows here. Right, if I go here and I take a look and I pull this down, you now see that our plural site service does non-UI processing, the timestamp, and when I click on it, it now displays our activity. Right? And that could have been any activity, right? And it could have been any number of things that are tied to pending intents in the Android platform. Now that we've seen how to go ahead and set up that initial notification that appears in the status bar, what we'll look at now is that what about when things go on in our program, we want to modify that status. As we talked about, we can change the icon, we can change the interactions, we can do any of those things we need to. Right? Well, to do that, we're going to go ahead and use the notification manager, because at this point, that notification that we're showing there is largely just a normal notification. So one of the things I'm going to need to do is go ahead and declare a reference to a notification manager, so I can use that in my program. So I've got that there. Of course, I need to create it. I can do that in my own create of my service. So I've got my notification manager. Now, notification manager is a system service. Right? So what we have to do then is from our context, or in this case from our this, we can say get system service. Right? And we identify what that system service is. And we want that notification service. Right, now I do need to cast a return type. So now I've got that there. So now I have that notification manager. So once I have the notification manager, I can now interact with my notifications. So let's add a function to our class here that just says set status icon. And all we're going to do in here is simply pass in the ID of an icon that we'd like to make the current one for the notification. Okay, so it's going to have to take in an integer, which will be our icon ID. And what we can do now is that when we're ready to actually modify the icon, we can just take our foreground notification. It has an icon field, and we'll just set it to the icon ID. And now that modifies the structure of our notification, so it now has a different icon associated with it. And now we just go to our notification manager. And we call our notify method. And we have to pass in the ID that we use for it. Remember, we set that constant up for that. And the notification we want to use. And so with that, now, anytime we call this function, if we pass it in an icon, the icon on the status bar will now change to that. So you notice that in addition to the icon I have here on the left, I've got the Pluralsight icon. I've also got a little green arrow icon here. So what might be neat to do is that whenever my service is actively doing something, maybe I'll go ahead and change that icon to be the green arrow. And then when it's in a pause state, I'll change it back to the Pluralsight icon. And so what I can do here is down here in my service run. Let's go get the service reference I have here. Set my status icon. And when it's running, I'm going to go ahead and get my drawable for my green arrow. Right, and when that's done, I'll set it back to the Pluralsight one. All right, so now when I run my service, I should see that icon changing at the top. When a service first starts up, I'll see the Pluralsight icon. As it's processing, it'll switch to the green arrow. When it finishes, it switches to the Pluralsight icon again. If I launch more processing, it'll again switch back and forth to the green arrow and then back to Pluralsight. All right, so we're in the emulator now. Go and click Menu. I'll run it. So our Pluralsight service starting shows up there. And now as we're processing, we've got our green arrow. As that processing continues, it remains a green arrow, and just as it finishes, it switches back to Pluralsight. If I run it again, now my service is already running, I won't see that initial ticker text go by, right? But I will actually see the green arrow start. And as I process it, it'll stay there. And then as my background processing finishes, it switches back again to our Pluralsight icon.